It was just another ordinary day at school. The bell had rung, signaling the start of third period, and I was sitting in my history class, half listening to the teacher drone on about World War II. The classroom was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paper or click of a pen. I remember staring out the window, bored, when the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, students and staff." The principal's voice came through, sounding tense, almost shaky. "We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately." For a moment, no one moved. We all looked at each other, unsure if we heard correctly. But then the reality of the situation hit, and the classroom erupted into nervous whispers. The teacher quickly shut the blinds and turned off the lights, motioning for us to get down behind our desks. My heart was pounding as I crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. The room was filled with the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional stifled sob. We had practiced lockdown drills before, but this felt different. It was real. The fear was palpable, like a thick fog settling over us. I remember clutching my phone, my hands trembling as I typed out a quick text to my mom. "In lockdown. Don't know what's happening. I'm scared." Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. We all froze, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My throat went dry as I heard the doorknob rattle softly. Someone was trying to get in. My teacher put a finger to her lips, signaling us to stay quiet. We all held our breath, praying that whoever was out there would move on. The door rattled again, harder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, to just go away. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching out into an eternity. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. We stayed there, huddled behind our desks, too terrified to move. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, my muscles aching from being crouched down for so long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the intercom crackled again. "All clear," the principal's voice announced, though it still carried that edge of fear. "The lockdown is over. Remain in your classrooms until further notice." We didn't move right away. No one wanted to be the first to stand up, to leave the safety of the desks. But eventually, the teacher got up and turned on the lights. We slowly started to rise, our legs stiff and shaky. The room was eerily quiet, the usual chatter absent as we all processed what had just happened. Later, we found out the details. Someone had been spotted on campus with a weapon. A man, not a student, had somehow entered the school and was seen wandering the halls. The police had been called, and he was apprehended before anyone was hurt. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. The thought that he had been right outside our door, trying to get in, was something I couldn't shake. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We were eventually allowed to go home, but the fear lingered. The school didn't feel safe anymore. Every sound, every creak of a door made me jump. For weeks after, I had nightmares about that day, about the footsteps in the hall, about the man trying to get in. I still do, sometimes. What scares me the most is how close it came to being something far worse. How for those few minutes, my life was in the hands of someone I couldn't see, someone whose intentions I couldn't know. The lockdown was over, but the fear never really left. It's always there, lurking just beneath the surface, reminding me of how quickly everything can change. How, in the blink of an eye, the ordinary can become a nightmare. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon, and the school day was dragging. I was in the middle of math class, barely paying attention to the lesson on the board, when the loudspeaker crackled to life. The principal's voice came through, tense and hurried. "Students and staff, we are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Lockdown procedures immediately." The classroom went dead silent. My teacher, Mr. Grayson, quickly walked to the door, locking it and pulling down the shade over the small window. "Everyone, get down," he whispered urgently. We all scrambled to the back corner of the room, away from the windows and door. My heart was pounding as I crouched behind a row of desks with my classmates. No one knew what was happening, but the fear in the room was thick. We huddled there in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of phones as a few of us frantically texted our parents. My hand shook as I typed out a message to my mom. "In lockdown. Don't know what's going on. Love you." Time seemed to stretch on forever as we sat in silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building. Then suddenly we heard it, a loud bang from somewhere down the hall. It sounded like a door being slammed open. My stomach flipped, and I could see the same fear reflected in the faces of my friends around me. Mr. Grayson motioned for us to stay quiet, his face pale. We heard footsteps then, heavy and slow, moving down the hallway. They were getting closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to disappear into the floor. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. There was a long, agonizing pause. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The door was locked, but whoever was out there wasn't giving up easily. The handle shook violently, and we could hear someone muttering just outside. Mr. Grayson slowly stood up, placing himself between us and the door. I could see the fear in his eyes, but he was trying to stay calm for our sake. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then, a loud metallic sound, like something being dragged along the lockers outside, echoed through the hallway. It was a grating, ominous noise that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the door shook as something heavy slammed against it. Once, twice. Whoever was out there was trying to break in. A few of my classmates started to cry softly, the terror too much to hold in. I could barely breathe, my entire body trembling. The door was strong, but with each hit, it felt like it was going to give way. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared down the hall. We stayed there, frozen, not daring to move or even breathe too loudly. Minutes passed, and then we heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer. The lockdown dragged on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the loudspeaker crackled again. "Students and staff, the lockdown is now over. Please remain in your classrooms until further instructions are given." The relief was immediate but cautious. We knew the danger had passed, but we still felt on edge. Later, we learned what had happened. A man had entered the school, armed and angry. He had no clear target, just a desperate need to cause harm. The police arrived just in time, apprehending him before he could break into any classrooms. They found him in the hallway outside our room, still trying to get through the door. It was over, but the fear lingered. We were all sent home early, and the rest of the week was canceled. The school was never the same after that. Lockdown drills became more frequent, and the sense of security we once had was shattered. Every time I hear a loud noise or see a shadow in the hallway, I'm brought back to that moment, crouched in the dark, listening to the sound of someone trying to break down the door. It was a normal Friday afternoon, the kind where everyone's just waiting for the weekend to start. I was in the library during study hall, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, just killing time. The room was quiet, with a few other students scattered around, some working, others just pretending to. Mrs. Keller, the librarian, was at her desk, typing away at her computer. The soft hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. Then, without warning, the intercom crackled. "Attention, students and staff." The principal's voice was tense, almost shaky. "We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill." I repeat, this is not a drill. The atmosphere in the library changed instantly. Mrs. Keller shot up from her desk, her face pale. "Everyone, get down, now," she said, her voice low but urgent. We all looked at each other, the realization of what was happening hitting us hard. Chairs scraped against the floor as we hurried to find places to hide. I ducked behind a row of bookshelves, pressing myself as far back as I could. Mrs. Keller quickly locked the library doors and switched off the lights, plunging the room into an eerie half-darkness. The only light came from the windows at the far end, where the blinds were partially drawn, casting long shadows across the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of someone's rapid breathing nearby. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My mind was racing, a million thoughts colliding all at once. What was going on? Was someone in the school? Were they close? I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. Then, from somewhere down the hall, we heard it. A loud crash, like something heavy being thrown against a wall. The sound echoed through the empty corridors, sending a jolt of fear through all of us. I could see the others around me, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Keller was crouched behind her desk, her eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. More noises followed, the distant sound of shouting, though it was hard to make out the words. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps slowed as they neared the library, and I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards just outside the door. Someone was out there. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The doorknob rattled, and I felt a wave of panic. But the door was locked, and for a moment, that seemed to be enough. The rattling stopped, and I hoped, desperately, that whoever it was would move on. But then came a soft, deliberate knock. Just 3 taps, slow and methodical. We all froze, our fear so intense it was almost suffocating. The knock came again, harder this time. Mrs. Keller shook her head at us, silently pleading for us to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I could see the terror in her eyes, the same fear we all felt. Then, the doorknob started to turn, slowly at first, then more forcefully. Whoever was out there wasn't giving up. The door shook as they tried to push it open, but the lock held. After what felt like an eternity, the door stopped moving. The footsteps retreated down the hall, the sound growing fainter until there was nothing but silence. We stayed frozen in place, too scared to move, even though the immediate danger seemed to have passed. The tension was unbearable, every second dragging on endlessly. Then, finally, the intercom crackled again. "The lockdown is now over." The principal's voice came through, shaky but relieved. "The situation has been resolved. Please remain in your classrooms until further instructions." Mrs. Keller let out a breath she'd been holding, and slowly we began to emerge from our hiding spots. The room was filled with a nervous energy, everyone talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But even as we stood up and the lights came back on, the fear didn't fully leave. Later, we found out that a man had entered the school, someone from the outside. He was agitated, angry, and had gotten past the front office. He hadn't managed to get into any classrooms, thanks to the lockdown, and the police arrived before he could cause any harm. But knowing how close he had come to the library door, how he had tried to get in, it was something none of us could forget. The school day ended early and we were all sent home, but the fear lingered. The next week, we were back in class, but everything felt different. The sounds of the hallway, the sight of the locked doors, it all reminded us of that day, of the knock on the library door, and the terror that had gripped us all. It was over, but none of us would ever feel truly safe in that building again.